All right, you're on.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mansoor Javidan. I'm a professor at Thunderbird School of Global Management. By now, you should know me very well. Thank you for joining me in this session. And we are also recording this session for students who want to watch it at a later time. I'm going to go over a number of questions that have already been sent to us. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone in the audience may have. And you can write your question and we will go over that. Let me start by saying that the questions that have been asked are really, really sophisticated questions and very thoughtful questions. I was very pleased to see the level of maturity of these questions, which tells me a lot of the learners who are taking this course are experienced people, are knowledgeable people, and are also taking this seriously. So that's wonderful to know. Let's get started. I'm going to read the questions first, and some of the questions are multiple sentences and multiple questions, so I'm going to go piece by piece because I want to try to answer all of them. So the first question is, I have read that the ability to learn languages other than our own native language is easier to learn while still a child. Yes, that is true. There's a lot of evidence for that. And the reason, by the way, or one of the major reasons for the fact that children are quicker in learning languages is that the brain of the adults has been structured as they grow up and speak a particular language. Their brain learns the way that that language works. So now when you add a separate language, a second language, structure for the second language. But for a child, especially for a young, very young child, the brain hasn't figured out yet the structure for the mother tongue. So it's flexible and it absorbs and adjusts to multiple languages much more easily. Now, that's the first part of the question. The second part is, I was curious about people who had moved to live in different cities or countries during their childhood. Had there ever been any research analyzing global mindset than people who had lived in one place for the rest of their lives? The answer is a very big yes. I'm actually publishing a paper exactly on this topic. Here is what we have found. People who have lived in multiple countries, people who have been educated in multiple countries, people who have friends from multiple countries, and people who know families from multiple countries, and people who speak multiple languages, in other words, have learned multiple languages as they've grown up, tend to have much higher global mindset scores. We've tested this hypothesis. We've shown the results with over 1,000 managers. It's a very sophisticated paper and it's written for academics, but the findings are very, very clear that the answer is a definite yes. By the way, for those of you who have children, there's a very important message for you. If you are interested in developing the global mindset of your children as soon as possible, there are many opportunities for you. Bottom line is, expose them to diversity, expose them to different kinds of food, expose them to different languages, expose them to different cultures, take them on trips to different parts of the world. All of those are very powerful means of developing the global mindset of your children. All right, I'm going to move on to the second question. What is the best way for adults to learn a language, and how does this help with the global mindset? Well, as I pointed out a little earlier, we have a very strong evidence that the ability to speak multiple languages is highly correlated with a strong global mindset. So, very simple answer: if you speak multiple languages, you are more likely to have a higher global mindset. There's a number of reasons for that. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but the relationship is very strong. Now, the question is, what is the best way for adults to learn a language? In the old days, many years ago, teaching of a language used to be treated as a very cognitive experience. So we teach you grammar, we teach you words, we teach you sentences, verbs, all of that. Today, however, there's a much more sophisticated approach to teaching languages. The view is that a language is more than a bunch of words and a bunch of sentences and a bunch of grammar. It's about a particular way of seeing the world. It's about a particular way of understanding the world, living life. So the best way to learn language is to do a multiple set of things. One is, of course, to learn they become actually very sophisticated. And that's one step. The second step is exposing yourself to the culture behind that language, from who speak that language, and asking them to speak their language in communicating with you. Trying different things related to that language. For example, movies from that particular country, food, going to restaurants that serve that kind of food, and actually asking them, the servers, the chef, etc., some of the language that goes with that food. So, in other words, there is a cognitive side of language, and that can be done rather easily through companies like Berlitz or a whole bunch of other, Rosetta Stone. They do a good job of efficiently teaching cognitive side of language. But then you need to supplement that with real life examples and interactions and exposures to that language. Okay, so let's move to the third question. Working in Germany, I have certain communication norms within my workplace. However, when working with different cultures in business, there is more confusion because of different communication styles. What is the best way to deal with this? Very interesting question. As a matter of fact, this question is what this whole course is all about. So you're going to, through this particular question, that in designing, creating this course, this question was the question that I was trying to answer. But I'm going to give you some very specific and quick answers about what do you do when you're interacting with people from other parts of the world. Number one, reflect on your own way of communicating. Ask yourself, how is it that we Germans like to communicate? Now, what I just said may sound so silly, but the fact is that people tend to ignore or take for granted their own cultural lens. So they don't pay attention. They just do things like breathing. They just do things without thinking about it. Well, what I'm asking you to do is actually think about it. So remind yourself that Germans typically, not every German, but German people typically prefer a formal style of communication. For example, they don't call people with their first name. They prefer to call them with their last name. Well, Americans are the opposite. It's very normal for Americans to refer to anybody using their first name. German people are not typically enjoying a lot of short conversations. They tend to see any kind of conversation that's not related to the objective as a waste of time. So small talk, things like that is not popular among many Germans. But in many cultures, that's very important and very true. So step number one is reflect on, identify some specific aspects of how you as a German person communicate. Step one. Step two, ask yourself, how do the people from other cultures, customers or partners or clients or supply chain partners or employees or colleagues, how do they communicate? So if I, as a German, don't like small talk, what about them? Do they like small talk? So try to understand the cultural lens of the other side. That's step number two. You can ask them, you can investigate, you can read about it, you can watch videos about it. There are many ways that you can learn about the other culture. Step number three, managers actually don't do a very good job of. Step number three is to communicate and exchange ideas about the two cultural lenses. So as a German manager working with a Malaysian employee, step one, you reflect on your German way of doing things. Step two, you learn about the Malaysian cultural lens. Step three is the two sides learning about each other. It's not just about you learning about Malaysian way. You need to help them is to create an environment where you and the Malaysian or the person from another part of the world actually share experiences. Isn't it interesting that we in Germany do things this way and you guys do that way? The point of that conversation is, number one, you're trying to explain and make it clear that it's not about who's right or who's wrong. It is not about who's bad and who's good. It's about the fact that we are different. We have developed different ways of doing things. So let's understand each other. Let's make sure that I, as a German, know some of the things that are important in the communication style to Malaysians, and my Malaysian counterpart learns about some of the things that are important about the German way of communicating. Once you go through step number three, step number four means flexibility. Be made some adaptation that needs to take place. So these four steps tend to work in many cases that I've been involved with and many managers that I have worked with. All right, question number four. How do politics impact global communication? Wow, this is really a very interesting question. You know, the social media and technology created a unique situation in human history. And that is the ability for people from 180 countries all over the world to start communicating, to share information. That's a fantastic opportunity that technology creates. Sharing information. It has increased our reach as human beings. But just like everything about human beings, I don't know if you've noticed, everything we do as human beings is not perfect. Everything we do as human beings has a good side and a bad side. So we create technology, we create social media to expand the reach. Well, the reach could be for good information. It can also be for bad information. So the relevance of politics in global communication is that all parties who have a message, who want to communicate, have now access to technology, have a global audience. The message they want to share may be totally nonsensical, may be absolutely helpful, may be sheer lies, or it may be political messages that particular people want to impress on other people. So as a result, going back to the question, how do politics impact global communication? The impact of politics is that it has created a lot of noise in global communication. Some of it good, many of it bad. So now we're exposed to global political, realize that it is a political message. But that is what technology has made available, good and bad. All right, let's go to question number 5. In the Globe materials, you discuss the theoretical definition of culture as it is today. Is this cultures are living phenomena? Remember how I defined and how I explained in my video about what the culture is. As we live our lives, we learn how things are done in our society. So, a child grows up in a German city, and he or she learns that if I'm driving a car, I need to follow the road rules and regulations very strictly. How does that child learn? Sometimes explicitly, that his or her parents tell him that. Sometimes implicitly, but just watching. The child in the car, the mother is driving, the mother is paying a lot of attention to rules of the road. The child learns that. Now, another child is growing up in Mexico City. And he or she learns that if you follow the rules, you will never get to your destination because nobody else pays attention to the rules of the road. So we develop our cultural lens as we live life. Now, if our experiences are different, if a child's experience in 2020 is different from a child's experience in 1895, then the culture is changing. And in fact, I'd like to share with you that as we speak, we are engaged in the next phase of the Globe project, where one of our questions is specifically, to what extent have cultures changed between mid-1990s when we collected the data and 2020 or 2019 when we are collecting the data right now from all of the original countries plus some additional ones. But we are collecting data from managers countries of mid-1990s. We are cultural practices, and our objective is to answer your question in a more empirical way by showing to what extent has the culture changed. And by the way, let me give you a more nuanced concept of culture change. What's really important to understand is that some dimensions of culture may change a lot. Some dimensions of culture may change very little, or some, and some dimensions of culture may not change at all. So when we use the phrase change of culture, we need to be a little more sophisticated and ask ourselves which aspects, which dimensions of a culture are changing at what pace. All right, let me now go to the next set of questions. One of our students has asked me 8 very sophisticated questions and very tough questions. So I'm going to start with her first question. Is there a tool that complements GLOBE to assess individuals within a culture that you would recommend for global managers? The answer is yes. There's a consulting firm called Aperion in San Francisco. They've created a tool called GlobeSmart. You can Google GlobeSmart, one word. It's an instrument that asks you to reflect on your own personal way of doing things. And they've collected data similar to GLOBE. They've collected data from thousands of managers in many countries. So you can do a self-assessment and you can compare it with country averages for whatever country. The tool is GlobeSmart, but it's a consulting firm, so they charge for their services. But it's a pretty popular tool that many corporations use. All right, second question. One of the points about how culture can manifest in different ways in different generations made me wonder, how frequently do you assess country cultures to keep insights accurate as part of a GLOBE? Again, very good question. We know that a major driver of culture change is economic growth and economic prosperity. So in countries like China, where over a 30-year period, the country has gone through massive, unprecedented economic growth and prosperity, you expect quicker cultural change. In countries like the US, or Germany, or the Netherlands, you would expect a slower pace of all right. Sorry, we had a little bit of a technical thing. So in some countries, the pace of change is much faster than others because of the economic situation that they're going through. Now, having said that, as a researcher interested in exactly in the same question, I hope that it is time to start collecting new data on country cultures. Because the original GLOBE data was collected in the mid-90s. So by 2019, we're looking at about 25 years. That would be kind of at the minimum range of the period. 30 years is even better because it gives you more opportunity to observe the changes that have taken place. But 25 is a pretty good time period. And that's where we're going with our data collection right now. Okay, let me go to third question. How does the use of globe dimensions differ for multicultural societies and unicultural societies? So in the original globe study that you are now very familiar with, we didn't pay much attention to the reality of multicultural societies. For example, in Switzerland, we had data from French-speaking Swiss managers and German-speaking Swiss managers. In Canada, we tried to collect data from French-speaking Canadian managers and English-speaking Canadian managers, but we ended up only with Canadian Anglophones, English-speaking managers. In South Africa, we collected data from African managers. So we did some analysis of multicultural societies, but not a lot. In the current phase of GLOBE, we have developed a much more sophisticated measure of to what extent are there subcultures in each country. Why? Because, first of all, we have learned as a result of the past 20-some years of research that subcultures are really important. And so as a result, we've developed a series of questions that would help us to compare and contrast. For example, in the US, we ask people to tell us, are they from Northeast? Are they from Southwest? Are they from Midwest? And in many other countries, the same thing. We've come up with a variety of ways of trying to identify potential subcultures in every country. All right. Let's go to question number 4. Are there some globe dimensions that are more fixed than others? If so, which ones and why? See, this is the question we're asking right now in our GLOBE project. We do not have an empirical answer to your question. We will have the answer to that question first quarter of 2020. So if you're interested in knowing the empirical answer, keep in touch with us. But let me tell you our theoretical answer to that. So we believe theoretically that a culture like power distance or hierarchy is very difficult to change. For a variety of reasons, we expect to see smaller change in power distance. And by the way, when I say that, what I mean is in cultures where power distance is low, we will continue to see it low, not much change. In cultures that power distance is high, we will continue to see it high. So that's an example of a dimension that is really hard to change. An example of a question that we expect, we theorize to see a greater change in is performance orientation. We expect to see some of the countries that were low in performance orientation in the mid-90s to show up higher on performance orientation. Why? Because the countries have changed their regulations, their rules, they're more globally exposed, they're seeing a lot more foreign investment, they're interacting with foreign countries and companies to a much larger extent, so it has had impact on performance orientation. So an example of power distance, very little change, performance orientation, more change, theoretically. Empirically, we'll know the answer by end of first quarter 2020. Okay, next question. Are there any case studies that show the evolution of globe dimensions within a given country? What might cause change to happen rapidly or more slowly? Again, about change. We don't know a lot about studies of culture change. The subject is a tough subject to study because you need to do it over, as I mentioned, over a long period of time. But I just gave you some examples of why a culture might change. Economic prosperity and growth, global exposure, which means imports, exports, foreign investment, changes in rules and regulations, government policies is a very big deal. So World Trade Organization has tried in many ways to push governments of many countries to clean up, streamline, improve their rules and regulations to encourage investment and foreign investment. So these are some of the examples of the forces of culture change. Question lens, what would you recommend? This goes back to my answer. If you want to reduce the impact of your own cultural lens, step number one is to know your own cultural lens, to reflect on it, to make sure you understand it and you surface it. So that's really important because human beings take their cultural lens for granted. They do not think about it. Now, once you reflect and surface your cultural lens, flexibility is critical. Reminding yourself that the same way that I grew up in a particular country, did things, have learned to do things in a particular way, exactly the same way is true about other people in other cultures. Therefore, my way of doing things is not the only way in the world. There are other ways. So flexibility means understanding that diversity and having a positive attitude towards it rather than having a negative attitude towards it. So good luck with it. Question 7. Is the benefit of learning languages strictly that it makes one better able to communicate? The answer is yes. Absolutely. If you learn multiple languages, it makes it easier for you to communicate with people from other cultures. So that's first part of the question. Is it about thinking with nuance? The answer is yes. When you speak multiple languages, your worldview changes. Your worldview becomes a little more sophisticated. It becomes more nuanced. Anytime you understand that there are other ways of looking at it. Very simple example. If you are globally exposed and somebody uses the word football, you know that Americans define the word football differently from the way Europeans do. That's a nuance. Finally, the last part of the question, or is it thinking in a different structure actually beneficial as well? The answer is yes. In other words, these three questions that you have asked are not mutually exclusive. They all work at the same time. There is very strong evidence that kids who grow up learning and speaking multiple languages, their brain functions differently. Neuroscience of language is very clear. There is a different structure to the brain if the child speaks multiple languages. is a really complex question. If an international manager had a very short amount of time to prepare for an important meeting with someone from another culture, what activities would you recommend for each of the following timelines? 1 hour. If I understand the question correctly, you're asking me, I have 1 hour to prepare for a meeting with someone from Japan. What can I do in 1 hour to learn? My answer is go to the website. It's called culturegrams.com. Culturegrams.com. Pay $4.50. Download the report, a cultural report on Japan. It's about 10 pages. It'll give you basic information. If you have 1 hour, that's what I would do. How about 1 day? The student is asking, if I have 1 day before meeting with my Japanese colleagues or counterparts, what do I do? Well, in addition to going to website, I would check to see if there are any Japanese colleagues in my own organization. If they are, I would contact them and have talks with them. I would try to learn from them about Japanese way of doing things. If there are no Japanese colleagues in my company, I would try to figure out, do I have any colleagues in my company who have experience in Japan and with the Japanese? If they do, I would try to contact them. And by the way, in between, I would go to a Japanese restaurant for lunch and for dinner. The third part of the question is, if I have 1 week, I'm going to combine 1 week and 1 month. I would study more. I would read books about them. I would talk to more people. I would definitely spend a lot of time in different Japanese restaurants. I would see if I can find Japanese people to talk with and become friends with. I would also go to the internet and explore a few things about Japan. For example, Japan over the past decade has had several natural disasters. Well, how did they deal with that? Did the communities come together? Was it looting? All kinds of things. And by going through how people reacted to natural disasters, if there is a blackout in Tokyo, it's very unlikely that you would see any looting. If there's a blackout in New York, you are very likely to see a lot of looting. That tells you something about how people live their lives. So why is it that there is no looting in Japan? So here are ways that I would spend the week or the month to learn more about how things are done in that part of the world. All right. Well, that brings me to the end of my questions. Are there additional questions?
Yes.
Okay.
We actually have 4 additional questions.
All right.
So we'll start with the first one from Garrett. As I was wondering if the real global mindset test is also an assessment of oneself, or is it a standardized test which measures one's global mindset more objectively?
Okay, so as you pointed out, Garrett, the instrument that you completed is a self-assessment. So is there any validity to a self-assessment tool? The answer is it depends on the objective. If the objective of the self-assessment in Global Mindset or any other tool is personal development, and that is the only objective that's valid for self-assessment. If the only objective is, I want to learn, how can I improve myself? Then self-assessment questionnaires do work. There's a lot of evidence for that. But if you add any other objective to self-assessment, then you lose validity of the instrument. Now, so that's about self-assessment. But you had another part of the question. How can we do an objective test of people's global mindset? Well, when you say objective, you are really talking about intellectual capital. Because the other two, there's nothing objective about them. Psychological capital and social capital are not objective. Intellectual capital is cognitive. So yes, instead of, or in addition to having a global mindset self-assessment, you can create a test about political system in Asia, several countries in Asia. You can create a test about regulatory regimes in multiple countries in Latin America. So the person has to give objective answers to these questions. So that would be the objective side. But I think your question misses the point a little bit. The point of global mindset is not to measure it objectively. Because as I mentioned, there are parts of it that there's nothing objective about them. So what is critical and a much more effective measure of global mindset is to do a 360 version of the instrument, where you do your own self-assessment, your supervisor does an assessment of you, your peers do an assessment of you, and your direct reports do an assessment of you. And we have created the 360 version of the tool, and there is a 360 report because it's really a complicated tool. But we do use it with corporate clients and some EMBA programs at some universities. Now, the beauty of the 360 is that you do your own self-assessment, so you look at yourself through your own subjective lens. But then you do reality check by comparing how you are seen in the eyes of other people. And that gives you the ability to ask yourself, am I being realistic about myself? Do other people see me the same way that I see myself? Or if there's a difference, why? So that's the purpose of the 360 instrument.
All right, our next question is from Renee C13. What happens when you are in a multicultural setting where you may have an audience who prefers direct, honest communication, while the others prefer a more soft, mellow language? What strategies would you advise in this type of setting?
All right, so you are in a French manager, and you have a number of Dutch employees and Thai employees and Japanese employees and German employees. They're all on your team. Some of them are very direct language types, such as Dutch and Germans. And some of them are very soft and implicit language speakers, such as Malaysians, Thai, Japanese. So your question is, what do I do with these people? Well, the first thing you do is, again, surface their cultural lens. So create an environment, either through assessments or even just conversations. Get each person to talk about what does it mean to be an effective communicator in their culture? What does it mean to be a bad communicator in their culture? What are the taboos in their culture? And if you're in a meeting, a face-to-face meeting, you actually write all of that and on flip charts, and you post them on the walls. And you see that to Germans, a good communicator means I'm very explicit. I tell you exactly what I have in mind. There's no emotions here. It's all logic. And the next chart will show you that the Malaysian person says an effective communicator pays a lot of attention to the feelings of the other person. So what he or she says and how he or she says it has to be very carefully managed. So you bring it all out, put on the walls. If it's done virtually, you create PowerPoints. And then, after everything is out, you get the group to ask themselves, okay, so how do we work together? Let's create a protocol for our own group. So when the German person uses very explicit and direct language, the Thai person doesn't get upset. Or when the Thai person uses mild language, the German person doesn't get frustrated. So you bring it all out and you get them to have a conversation about, okay, now that we understand we're different, let's create a protocol, a procedure for all of us to effectively communicate with each other. And let's have fun with it. Next question.
We have two more questions.
All
this
right.
is from Waverly. One more question. For a global manager starting in a new role at a multinational company, what are some things to do when trying to adapt to a new organizational culture? Do you have any specific tips for the airline industry?
Okay, so you're hired by an airline, which is a big multinational airline, and this is a brand new experience for you. And your question is, how do I adapt? Can you read the last part of the question? I want to be very specific about it.
What are some things to do when trying to adapt to a new organizational culture?
Okay, very good. All right. So when you talk about a corporate culture, and as you know from my video, an organization has its own culture. The corporation has its own culture. The culture of the corporation is driven by three major forces. The culture of Air France is different from the culture of American Airlines, partly because one is French and one is American. So their nationality plays a big role. Number two, the industry has its own culture. So corporations in an industry develop cultures that are suitable for that industry. So the culture of airline industry is very different from the culture of railroad industry or computer industry. So industry is the second force. The third force is the history of the company itself, how it has been run, who have been the CEOs, who have been the leaders of the company. So now let me go specifically to your question. In order for you to adapt to this multinational company's culture, you need to know something about the national culture, something about the industry culture, and something about the history of that company. So if you have been hired by Air France, you need to learn about the French culture. Globe Smart, other tools is your step number one. Step number two, you need to learn about the airline industry in general. How do you do that? You go to sources like Economist Intelligence Unit, EIU.com, and you search for airline industry, and you download reports on the global airline industry. And that gives you information about how that industry works. And there are other sources. I'm just giving you one example. The third force is the history of the company. You need to read up about what this company's history is, what have they done in the past, and then go around and talk to people. Invite them to coffee, invite them to lunch, ask them about who are the heroes of this company, what have been the major events in the history of this company, how do people in this company communicate. Ask a whole bunch of questions about what are the values of this company, who gets promoted in this company, is this an entrepreneurial company, is this a political company, is this a bureaucratic company, is this a goal-oriented, performance-oriented company. So you try to develop a little database through these conversations, and there may be other public sources about the company that you can read. But that's how you put a dossier together about the company. Once you do that, then you need to ask yourself, okay, now that I understand what's going on, what are some specific steps that I need to take to be a player in this game? Thank you, Waverly. You ask very good questions.
All right, and our final question. This is from Barbara. Most of the information shared in this course so far has addressed communication between two groups who are desiring to work with one another toward a common goal. However, there are instances where two different cultural groups are required to work together where one or both groups are disgruntled or adversarial. How does this impact the interaction? And how would one group try to diffuse the situation or change the adversarial mindset of the other group?
So I worked with a joint venture between a British company and a Russian company. And the two parties to the joint venture had completely different objectives. There was nothing in common. Joint venture was making a lot of money, but it was a daily fight between the British managers and the Russian managers. And by the way, the Russians spoke reasonably well English, but the British managers did not speak Russian at all. And the headquarters of the joint venture was in Moscow. And they asked me to figure out a way of getting these two sides to be a little less hostile and a little more friendly to each other. And I'm going to tell you, it is not easy at all. It is very hard. You're dealing with realities. People's objectives are different. So, what did we do? My objective was to create some common goals. Okay, we know both sides have very different priorities, objectives, but are there things that would make sense for both sides? It took us quite a while to figure it out because at some point they weren't even talking to each other. So trying to find some common elements is critical. If you cannot find anything in common, good luck with it. It's not going to work because both sides are very rational. They are saying, I'm not going to work with you because working with you doesn't add value to me. If you can show me that working with you adds value to me, then I'm happy to work. That's what I'm saying when I say common themes, common objectives, common values. Something that both sides look at it and say, yeah, that's worth my time. I'm willing to invest my time because I'm going to get value out of it. Cannot identify that, there's very little hope. All right, anything else?
That is all we have for this session today.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you all again for very, very good questions and very thoughtful ideas. I hope you will enjoy the rest of the course, and I look forward to being with you in our next live session.
Check your email about the GMI. We're going to start
start sending their information for the ID verified.
You want to tell them that? I have an announcement for you. My colleague Heather is going to give you an announcement.
Hi. So make sure those of you that are ID verified to check your email. We're going to start sending out the information for the Global Mindset Inventory.
Yes.
So that'll go to the email address that you have registered for your edX account. So watch for that. Check your junk just in case, because it may go to junk since it's an unknown email address. So more information, check the discussion board as well.
All right. Thank you again, and I hope you will enjoy the rest of the course. Bye-bye.